Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is TheShadowScript, and tonight I bring you 10 tales of terror that will make you question every creak in your house. These stories come from the darkest corners of human imagination, where evil lurks beneath the surface of ordinary life. So turn down the lights, lock your doors, and prepare yourself for nightmares made real. The Morgan family thought they had found paradise when they discovered the old Victorian farmhouse nestled in the hills of rural Vermont. The asking price was suspiciously low, but the realtor explained it away with talk of the local economy and the previous owner's urgent need to sell. What she didn't mention were the whispers that followed the Blackwood name through 3 generations of blood. Sarah Morgan ran her fingers along the ornate banister as she climbed the creaking stairs for the first time. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows that seemed to writhe across the hardwood floors. Her husband Tom was already in the kitchen, talking excitedly about the potential for renovation, but Sarah felt something else entirely, a coldness that seemed to seep from the very bones of the house. "The floorboards in the dining room feel loose," Tom called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "We might need to replace some of them." That first night, Sarah lay awake listening to the house settle around them. Every groan of timber, every whisper of wind through loose shutters, seemed to carry an underlying rhythm, like breathing or perhaps sobbing. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were filled with the sound of something dragging across the floor above her head. The restoration began in earnest the following week. Tom had taken time off from his job in Boston, determined to do most of the work himself. It was while prying up the warped floorboards in the dining room that he first noticed the stains. Dark patches had seeped deep into the wood, creating abstract patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "Probably just water damage," Tom muttered, though the stains were a deep reddish brown that water had never been known to produce. He called Sarah over to look, pointing out how the discoloration seemed to radiate outward from a central point near the room's center. Sarah knelt beside the exposed subflooring, running her finger along the edge of one particularly dark stain. The wood felt different here, rougher, as if it had been scraped or clawed. "Tom," she said quietly, "I think this might be blood." Her husband laughed nervously. "Come on, Sarah. You've been reading too many of those mystery novels. It's probably just old wine or something." But as they continued removing floorboards, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The stains formed a rough circle, with smaller splatters radiating outward like the aftermath of violence. And beneath the largest concentration of stains, they found something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Scratch marks gouged deep into the wooden beams, as if someone had clawed desperately at the floor from below. That night, Sarah researched the house's history online. What she found made her stomach turn. The previous owner, Ezra Blackwood, had lived alone in the house for 43 years. He'd been found dead in the dining room in 1987, apparently from a heart attack. But there were whispers, rumors that had never made it into official reports. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds coming from the house at night, of visitors who arrived but were never seen leaving. The local newspaper archives revealed more disturbing details. Over the decades Blackwood had lived there, 17 people had gone missing in the surrounding area. Hikers, drifters, traveling salesmen, people who wouldn't be missed immediately. The disappearances had stopped abruptly after Blackwood's death. Sarah showed Tom the articles, but he remained skeptical. "You're letting your imagination run away with you," he said, though she noticed he'd grown quieter since they'd started working on the dining room. "Even if something did happen here, that was almost 40 years ago. The past is the past." The first sign that the past wasn't quite as buried as Tom believed came 3 days later, while Sarah was scraping paint from the dining room walls. She heard footsteps on the floor above, slow, deliberate steps that moved from room to room with familiar purpose. But Tom was outside working on the porch and they were alone in the house. Sarah climbed the stairs cautiously, following the sound. The footsteps seemed to stay just ahead of her, always in the next room, always just out of sight. When she reached the master bedroom, the sound stopped entirely. The room was empty, but Sarah could swear she felt a presence watching her from the shadows. That evening, she mentioned the footsteps to Tom over dinner. He suggested the house was settling, that old wood often made sounds that could be mistaken for footsteps. But his explanation felt hollow, and Sarah noticed he kept glancing toward the dining room doorway as they ate. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. Tools would disappear from where Tom had left them, only to turn up in impossible places, buried in the garden, hidden in the walls behind freshly hung drywall, floating in the well behind the house. The temperature in the dining room would drop suddenly, turning their breath to mist even on warm summer days. But it was the dreams that truly terrified Sarah. Every night, she found herself standing in the dining room, watching as a tall, gaunt figure moved about with practiced efficiency. The man, she somehow knew it was Ezra Blackwood, would drag something heavy across the floor, leaving wet trails that gleamed in the moonlight. The scratching sounds she'd heard that first night weren't the house settling at all. They were the desperate scraping of fingernails against wood as victims tried to claw their way out of the space beneath the floor. In her dreams, Blackwood would look up at her with hollow, hungry eyes and smile. "Welcome home," he would whisper, and Sarah would wake gasping and drenched in cold sweat. The breaking point came when Tom decided to excavate beneath the dining room floor. Despite Sarah's pleas to leave it alone, he'd become obsessed with the stains, convinced there was a logical explanation that would put their fears to rest. He rented a small excavator and began digging in the crawl space beneath the house. What he found there ended any hope of rational explanation. The bones were arranged carefully, almost reverently, in a shallow grave that stretched the entire length of the dining room above. 17 sets of remains, just as Sarah had read in the newspaper archives. But these weren't the dry, ancient bones she might have expected. They gleamed wetly in the excavator's lights, as if the flesh had only recently been stripped away. Tom stumbled backward, his face pale with horror. "This is impossible," he whispered. "These bones, they look fresh." But Sarah was staring at something else entirely. Standing at the edge of the excavation, tall and gaunt and wearing the same hungry smile from her dreams, was Ezra Blackwood. His clothes were the same ones he'd worn the day he died, a faded flannel shirt and work pants stained with decades of blood. His skin had the waxy, translucent quality of something long dead, but his eyes burned with an awful intelligence. "You've been busy," Blackwood said, his voice like rustling leaves, "digging up my collection. I don't much appreciate that." Tom spun around, but he saw only empty air where Sarah was staring in terror. "Sarah? Sarah, what's wrong?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He can't see me yet. But he will. Oh, he will. This house has rules, you see. Traditions that must be honored. Blood that must be fed." The spirit began to circle them, moving with predatory grace. "I died in that room above us, but I never left. How could I? This place is my masterpiece, my gallery of screams. Every person who enters becomes part of the collection, eventually." Sarah tried to speak, to warn Tom, but her voice came out as a strangled whisper. Blackwood smiled wider, revealing teeth stained black with old blood. "The dining room was where I brought them, you see. One by one over the years. I'd sit them at my table, offer them hospitality, and then—" He made a slashing motion across his throat. "The blood would flow down through the cracks, feeding the earth below, keeping me strong even in death." Tom was backing toward the stairs, finally sensing something was wrong, but Blackwood moved faster. The temperature plummeted, and suddenly Tom could see the spirit too, a nightmare figure materializing from shadow and malice. "Welcome to the collection," Blackwood whispered, and lunged forward with fingers like icy knives. The Morgans tried to run, but the house itself seemed to turn against them. Doors slammed shut, stairs collapsed beneath their feet, and the walls began to bleed. The stains Sarah had found weren't just evidence of past murders. They were arteries in a living thing, and the thing was hungry. In the end, they joined the 17 beneath the dining room floor. Their blood seeped down through the cracks to nourish the bones below, and Ezra Blackwood added 2 more chairs to his eternal dinner party. The house went back on the market 6 months later, listed at an even lower price. The realtor mentioned something about the previous owner's urgent need to relocate, but she didn't mention the new stains that had appeared in the dining room, or the way the floorboards seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. And sometimes, on quiet Vermont nights, neighbors swear they can see figures moving past the dining room windows. 19 shapes gathered around a table, with one tall host serving a meal that never ends. The blood beneath the floorboards has been fed, but it's always hungry for more. 16-year-old Marcus Chen had always been sensitive to sounds others couldn't hear. His mother attributed it to his musician's ear. He played violin in the school orchestra, but Marcus knew it was something darker than musical talent that let him hear the whispers seeping up through the floorboards of their suburban home. The voices had started 3 weeks after his family moved into the house on Sycamore Street. At first, Marcus thought it was the neighbor's television bleeding through the walls, or perhaps the old heating system settling in the autumn chill. But as he lay in bed at night, straining to make out the words, he realized the sounds were coming from directly beneath his room. "Help us," the voices whispered, so faint they might have been his imagination. "Help us, please." Marcus's parents, Dr. Emily Chen and software engineer David Chen, were too busy with their respective careers to notice their son's growing unease. They'd moved to the quiet suburban neighborhood for Marcus's sake, hoping the change from city life would help him focus on his studies and prepare for college applications. The last thing they wanted to hear was complaints about imaginary voices. "It's just the house settling," his father said dismissively when Marcus brought it up over breakfast. "Old houses make all kinds of noises. You'll get used to it." But Marcus couldn't get used to the desperation in those whispered pleas. The voices were definitely children, possibly younger than himself. Sometimes he could make out names: Tommy, Jessica, Alex. Other times they simply sobbed, heart-wrenching sounds that made Marcus's chest tight with sympathy and fear. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late October. Marcus had been lying awake for hours, listening to the whispers grow stronger and more urgent. This time he could hear them clearly enough to understand full sentences. "He's coming back," a young girl's voice pleaded. "Don't let him take us again. Please, someone help us. We're so cold," another voice added, this one belonging to a boy who couldn't have been older than 10. "We've been down here so long. Our families? Do our families know where we are?" Marcus sat up in bed, his heart pounding. These weren't the random sounds of an old house. These were the voices of children in distress. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The crawlspace beneath the house was barely 3 feet high, nothing more than a dirt-floored cavity used for storing holiday decorations and old furniture. Unless... Marcus grabbed his phone and began researching the history of their house. What he found made his blood run cold. The previous owner, Harold Graves, had lived alone in the house for 15 years before his death from a stroke in 2019. But scattered throughout those 15 years were troubling police reports. Missing children from the surrounding neighborhoods, cases that had gone cold when investigators found no leads. 7 children in total. Ages ranging from 8 to 14. All had disappeared within a 5-mile radius of Marcus's house, and all had vanished without a trace. The police had questioned Graves multiple times, but he'd been cooperative and seemed genuinely concerned about the missing children. His alibi for each disappearance had been solid, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crimes. But Marcus was beginning to suspect that Harold Graves had been very good at not getting caught. The next day, while his parents were at work, Marcus decided to investigate the crawlspace. He found the access panel in the laundry room, a square wooden hatch that opened with surprising ease. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he squeezed through the opening and into the darkness below. The crawlspace was larger than he'd expected, extending beneath most of the house's first floor. The air was thick and stale, carrying an odd sweet-sour smell that made Marcus's stomach turn. As he crawled forward on his hands and knees, his flashlight beam revealed disturbing details that the previous owners had left behind. Chains. Rusty metal chains bolted to the support beams, each ending in shackles that were far too small to have been meant for adults. The dirt floor was stained with dark patches that Marcus desperately hoped were just water damage, though his instincts told him otherwise. And scattered throughout the space were personal items that made Marcus's heart break. A tattered teddy bear, a child's sneaker, a plastic barrette shaped like a butterfly. These were the belongings of the missing children, the ones whose voices he heard every night. But it was what Marcus found in the far corner that confirmed his worst fears. A pile of small bones, yellowed with age and partially buried in the dirt. Some still wore scraps of clothing, a Star Wars t-shirt, a pink dress with unicorns. Marcus backed away in horror, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hands. That's when he heard the voice directly behind him. "You shouldn't be down here." Marcus spun around, expecting to see Harold Graves somehow return from the dead. Instead, he found himself face to face with something far worse. Standing in the cramped space, impossible though it seemed, was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He wore a cardigan sweater and carried a plate of chocolate chip cookies, looking for all the world like someone's beloved grandfather. "I'm sorry if I startled you," the man said in a voice that was warm and reassuring. "I'm Harold Graves. I used to live here, you know. Still do, in a way." Marcus tried to scramble backward, but found his way blocked by the support beams. Harold's smile never wavered as he moved closer, seemingly unhindered by the low ceiling that forced Marcus to crawl. "I see you found my collection," Harold continued, glancing at the scattered bones with paternal fondness. "They were such good children. So trusting, so eager to help a lonely old man. Would you like a cookie? They're fresh from the oven." The plate in Harold's hands began to change as Marcus watched in horror. The cookies crumbled into ash and the plate itself rusted and cracked. Harold's appearance shifted too, his kind face becoming gaunt and predatory, his gentle smile revealing teeth stained with old blood. "The children tried to leave, you know," Harold said conversationally. "They'd scream and cry and beg to go home. But I explained to them that this was their home now. Down here in the dark where no one could find them. Where no one would think to look." The whispers Marcus had been hearing grew louder, and now he could see their sources. Translucent figures emerged from the shadows. 7 children in various states of decay, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of prolonged suffering. They reached toward Marcus with desperate, grasping hands. "Help us," they pleaded in unison. "Don't let him take you too." Harold's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "They've been such good company over the years. But they're growing tiresome, always begging and crying. I think it's time for some fresh blood, don't you?" Marcus found his voice at last. "My parents will look for me. The police will find nothing," Harold finished. "Just like they found nothing when I was alive. I was very careful, you see. Very methodical. Parents assumed their children ran away or were taken by strangers. They never suspect the kindly old man next door who helps them look for their missing pets." The spirit began to circle Marcus like a predator stalking prey. "I would invite them in for hot chocolate, tell them I'd seen their lost kitten in my backyard. And once they were down here, well, they never left. The crawlspace makes such a perfect playroom, don't you think? Private. Soundproof. No one can hear you scream." Marcus tried to crawl toward the access panel, but Harold moved to block his path. The other children pressed closer, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of visibility. "Please," one of them whispered, a girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "He hurt us for so long. Don't let him hurt you too." "Run," urged another, a boy wearing a baseball uniform. "Get out while you still can." But Harold was already reaching for Marcus with hands that seemed to stretch impossibly long. "Don't listen to them," he crooned. "They're just jealous because they want to keep playing. But you'll be much more fun, won't you? A teenager has so much more stamina than a child." Marcus felt icy fingers close around his ankle, and suddenly he was being dragged deeper into the crawlspace. The dirt scraped against his skin as he fought to break free, but Harold's grip was supernaturally strong. "Don't worry," Harold whispered as he pulled Marcus toward the chains. "The fear only lasts for the first few weeks. After that, you'll learn to accept your situation. They all do eventually." Marcus's phone had fallen during the struggle, its flashlight beam creating wild shadows that danced across the walls. In that strobing light, he could see the full horror of Harold's collection. Not just the 7 children he'd researched, but dozens more. Bones upon bones scattered throughout the crawlspace, the remains of decades of victims. "How many?" Marcus gasped, still fighting against Harold's grip. "I lost count after the first 20, Harold admitted with pride. "I've been at this for a very long time, you see. Even before I bought this house. But this place is special. The crawlspace calls to lost children, draws them in. Makes them easy to catch." One of the shackles clicked around Marcus's wrist with a sound like a death knell. The metal was cold and rough with rust, and Marcus could feel the despair of all the children who had worn it before him. "There now," Harold said soothingly. "That's much better. Now we can get properly acquainted. I do so enjoy the getting to know you phase. We have all the time in the world to become friends." But as Harold reached for the second shackle, the ghostly children suddenly surged forward. Their translucent forms blazed with sudden light, and Marcus felt their combined fury wash over him like a cleansing fire. "No more," the girl with pigtails said, her voice stronger than it had been. "We won't let you hurt anyone else." The children grabbed at Harold with hands that had somehow become substantial. He screamed as they pulled him away from Marcus, his form becoming less solid as their spirits grew brighter. "This is our space now," the boy in the baseball uniform declared. "And we're not letting you use it anymore." Harold's final scream echoed through the crawlspace as the children dragged him into whatever darkness waited beyond death. His form dissolved like smoke, leaving behind only the faint smell of sulfur and old blood. Marcus fumbled with the shackle around his wrist, finally managing to work it loose. The ghostly children watched him with sad, knowing eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. The girl with pigtails smiled, and for a moment she looked almost alive again. "Tell our families we love them," she said softly. "Tell them we're not lost anymore." One by one, the spirits began to fade, their long vigil finally over. The last to go was the boy in the baseball uniform, who looked back at Marcus with eyes full of peace. "Be careful," he warned. "There are others like him out there. Others who prey on children. But now you know what to listen for." Marcus crawled back to the access panel on shaking hands and knees, leaving behind the bones and chains and the echo of whispers that had finally found peace. When he emerged into the laundry room, he immediately called the police. The investigation that followed uncovered the remains of 43 children buried throughout the crawlspace and backyard. Harold Graves was posthumously identified as one of the most prolific serial killers in state history. The families of the missing children finally had answers and closure. The Chen family moved out within a week, unable to live in a house that had seen so much suffering. But sometimes on quiet nights in their new home, Marcus still hears whispers. Not pleas for help this time, but words of warning about other predators, other houses where children's voices call out from hidden spaces. Marcus has learned to listen. And when he hears those whispers, he calls the police, because some voices should never be ignored. The stench of decay clung to the October air as Sarah Chen's rental car crunched into the gravel driveway of the Millbrook Inn. A 3-hour drive from Boston had brought her to this forgotten corner of Vermont, where crimson leaves fell like blood and shadows moved with intent. Sarah was a journalist for Dark Truth magazine, specializing in the kind of stories mainstream outlets wouldn't touch. Her latest assignment: 7 mysterious deaths in Millbrook over 7 years, all in October, all ruled as suicides or accidents. The sheriff offered no answers. Locals whispered of something darker. Mrs. Hartwell, the innkeeper, eyed her warily as she handed over the key. "You're here about the deaths," she said flatly. "I'm researching local harvest traditions," Sarah offered. Mrs. Hartwell gave a gravelly laugh. "Call it folklore if you like, but you don't understand what you're dealing with." She leaned in close. "Leave. Tonight." But Sarah had never backed down from a story. In her room she reviewed the files. Marcus Delacroix, 2016, found hanging in his barn. Jennifer Walsh, 2017, throat slit in her corn maze. The Brennan twins, 2018, hearts removed in an old orchard. All lived next to the same ancient forest on Millbrook's eastern edge, the Hungry Woods. The sheriff's office stonewalled her, but grieving families spoke of an old pact, of a name they dared not speak aloud: Matthias Corvine. Official history called him a visionary farmer. Unofficial accounts said he made a deal. The next morning, Sarah visited the Millbrook Historical Society. An old man named Ashford led her to a dusty back room and handed her a leather-bound journal, Corvine's diary. September 30th, 1847. The entity in the woods has agreed to my terms. 7 harvests for 7 souls. The compact is sealed in blood. October 12th, 1854. The 7th soul has been claimed. Now the cycle must begin anew, or the entity will take what it pleases. Sarah looked up. Ashford's eyes were grave. Every 7 years. 7 lives. If the pact isn't honored, the entity feeds indiscriminately. Are you saying these people were murdered? I'm saying Millbrook made a choice a long time ago, he replied. You should leave, before it notices you. But Sarah stayed. That night, she ventured to the edge of the Hungry Woods, armed with a revolver, a recorder, and her instincts. At 11:47 p.m., a figure stepped from the trees, tall, gaunt, dressed like a ghost from the 1800s. His smile revealed pointed teeth. Miss Chin, he said. I was wondering when you'd come. Matthias Corvine, she breathed. In what's left of the flesh, he replied. The compact keeps me tethered. I don't kill. I simply deliver. The entity does the rest. Sarah raised her gun. And if I break the pact? He chuckled. Then it will gorge until sated, everyone within 50 miles. You're the 7th this cycle, Miss Chin. It's chosen you. The forest around her grew colder. The shadows thickened. Something massive moved behind Corvine, something with eyes that blinked sideways and mouths inside mouths. She fired 6 times. Corvine didn't flinch. Iron bullets? He mocked. How quaint. Sarah fought to stay grounded. The dates, she gasped. They align with new moons. But tonight isn't one. The whispering voices ceased. The creature stilled. Corvine faltered. The entity chooses when to feed. No. You pick these dates because it feeds on the new moon. Tonight's a waxing crescent. It can't take me. She pulled out her phone. My editor has everything. If I don't check in, the story goes live. Case files. DNA. Your confession. She raised her recorder. The forest held its breath. Then, slowly, the presence began to retreat. You're making a mistake, Corvine said, desperation cracking his voice. Without the compact. There'll be deaths, yes, Sarah said. But maybe it'll go dormant. Or maybe people will finally fight back. Either way, you're done hiding behind fear. The entity faded, unwilling to risk exposure. Corvine stepped forward, but age suddenly caught up with him. His body shriveled, collapsing under 177 years of borrowed time. "You don't understand," he rasped. "It'll come back. All this blood on your hands now." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but at least it won't be on your terms." She left the forest at dawn. 3 days later, her story, The Harvest Killings, a town's dark compact, rocked the nation. Federal agents uncovered a conspiracy stretching back generations. Sheriff Cordell and others were arrested. The hungry woods were sealed off. Matthias Corvine's body was found in a hidden cabin, dead of natural causes. All of them. Sarah won a Pulitzer. She never returned to Millbrook, though Mrs. Hartwell sent the occasional postcard. The entity never came back. But sometimes Sarah swore she could still feel something watching, far off, waiting for the world to forget. Because the truth she learned, once revealed, can never be buried again. The first painting arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine that looked decades old. Marcus Chin, owner of the Meridian Gallery in downtown Portland, found it propped against his back door like an abandoned child. No return address, no delivery slip, just the painting and a peculiar smell that reminded him of copper pennies left in the rain. Marcus unwrapped it in his office, expecting another amateur landscape or portrait from a hopeful local artist. Instead, he found himself staring at a scene that made his coffee grow cold in his hands. The painting depicted a dimly lit alleyway, rain-slicked pavement reflecting the yellow glow of a single streetlight. In the foreground, a woman lay crumpled against a dumpster, her red dress torn and darkened with what could only be blood. But it was the background that made Marcus's skin crawl, a figure partially hidden in the shadows, face obscured except for a wide, unnaturally white smile that seemed to glow in the darkness. The technique was masterful, almost photorealistic, but there was something deeply unsettling about the brushwork. The shadows seemed to move when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them, and that smile, it felt like it was watching him. Marcus set the painting aside, deciding to research the artist later. The signature in the corner was illegible, just a dark smear that might have been initials or might have been an accident. He had 3 other exhibitions to prepare for and a meeting with potential investors that afternoon. But as the day wore on, his eyes kept drifting back to the painting. There was something familiar about the alleyway, though he couldn't place it. Portland had hundreds of such places, narrow passages between buildings where the city's forgotten corners festered in permanent shadow. That evening, as Marcus locked up the gallery, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Woman found dead in downtown alley. His blood chilled as he read the details. 26-year-old Sarah Martinez, found behind the Paramount building on Morrison Street. She was wearing a red dress. The cause of death was being investigated, but preliminary reports suggested she had been brutally attacked. Marcus's hands shook as he unlocked the gallery and rushed back to his office. He stared at the painting with new horror. The alleyway in the image was identical to the crime scene photos now flooding social media. The woman's pose, her dress, even the way the streetlight cast shadows. Everything matched perfectly. But the painting had arrived that morning, hours before Sarah Martinez's body was discovered. Marcus tried to rationalize it. Coincidence. The artist must have painted a generic alley scene, and the similarities were just his imagination running wild after seeing the news. But deep down he knew he was lying to himself. The details were too specific, too exact. He decided to call the police in the morning. But morning brought another painting. This one showed the interior of what looked like a suburban kitchen. Cheerful yellow walls, a small breakfast table set for one, and on the floor an elderly man in a bathrobe, his face frozen in an expression of terror. Above him, barely visible in the reflection of the chrome refrigerator, was that same white smile. Marcus's phone rang before he could even fully process what he was seeing. Detective Lisa Hawthorne from Portland PD was calling about a homicide. Retired teacher Harold Vance, found dead in his kitchen that morning. The details she described matched the painting exactly. "Mr. Chin," Detective Hawthorne said, "we understand you received some unusual artwork recently. We'd like to take a look." Marcus told her everything, his voice trembling as he described the impossible timing. Detective Hawthorne listened without interruption, her silence more unnerving than questions would have been. She arrived within an hour, accompanied by 2 other detectives and a forensics photographer. They examined both paintings with the grim efficiency of people who had seen too much death. "The brush strokes are consistent," noted Dr. Emily Foster, the art forensics expert they'd called in. "Same hand painted both. But Mr. Chin, You're absolutely certain these arrived before the murders were committed? I have security footage, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. The first one was left sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. Tuesday. Sarah Martinez wasn't found until Tuesday evening. Detective Hawthorne's expression darkened. We're going to need that footage. And Mr. Chin, if any more paintings arrive, don't touch them. Call us immediately. But Marcus was already thinking about that smile. In both paintings it was exactly the same. Too wide, too white, like a jack-o'-lantern carved by someone who had never seen a human face. It wasn't just watching, it was hungry. The third painting arrived on Friday. Marcus found it himself this time, having taken to arriving at the gallery before dawn. His security system showed nothing. The camera simply went dark for 37 minutes, then resumed recording as if nothing had happened. During that missing time, someone had left their gift. This painting was different. It showed the interior of a home Marcus recognized immediately, his own living room. In the image, he sat in his leather reading chair, a book open in his lap, completely unaware of the figure standing behind him. The same figure from the other paintings, still wreathed in shadow, still wearing that horrific smile. But this time, the figure's hand was raised, holding something that glinted in the painted lamplight. Marcus called Detective Hawthorne with shaking fingers. She arrived within minutes, her face grim. "Pack a bag," she said. "You're not staying home tonight." But as they prepared to leave the gallery, Dr. Foster called out from the back room where she'd been examining the paintings under special lights. "Detective, you need to see this." Under ultraviolet illumination, the paintings revealed hidden details. In the first painting, barely visible text appeared along the bottom edge. Sarah knew too much about the Henderson case. In the second, Harold saw what happened to the Miller family. And in the third, the most chilling message yet, Marcus is next. He has what I need. What could you possibly have? Detective Hawthorne asked. Marcus shook his head. I don't know. I'm just a gallery owner. I don't know anything about any murders or... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening. Wait, the Henderson case. I remember that name. He rushed to his filing cabinet, pulling out folders with trembling hands. 3 years ago, a woman named Jennifer Henderson came to me. She wanted to display a series of paintings her brother had made before he died. Said he was documenting something important, but she never specified what. I turned her down. The paintings were too disturbing, too violent. But she left copies of the photos with me, said I might change my mind. Detective Hawthorne's radio crackled. Hawthorne, we've got another body. Jennifer Henderson, found in her apartment an hour ago. Looks like she's been dead for days. Marcus felt the world tilt around him. She's been dead for days? But the message said Sarah knew too much about the Henderson case. If Jennifer was already dead. Then someone killed Jennifer first, Detective Hawthorne finished. Someone who knew she was trying to expose them through her brother's paintings. Someone who's been tracking down anyone connected to whatever those paintings showed. Marcus retrieved the folder from his safe. Inside were photographs of 12 paintings, each one depicting a different murder scene. The techniques were different from the paintings he'd been receiving. Rougher, more urgent, like they'd been painted in haste. But in the background of each scene, partially hidden but always present, was a figure with a white smile. Jennifer's brother was documenting these murders, Marcus realized. He was painting them as they happened, or maybe he was painting them before they happened, like someone's doing to me now. Dr. Foster studied the photographs with a magnifying glass. Look at this, she said, pointing to the corner of one of the photos. There's a signature here. It's not the same as the new paintings, but it's similar. Like someone learned to forge it. The signature read D. Henderson 2019. David Henderson, Detective Hawthorne said, consulting her phone. Jennifer's brother. Died in a psychiatric facility 2 years ago. Official cause was suicide, but the circumstances were unusual. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The gallery. Midnight. Come alone or everyone you've ever cared about gets a portrait. Detective Hawthorne immediately began coordinating with SWAT teams and setting up surveillance, but Marcus knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever was doing this had been watching him, learning his routines, somehow bypassing every security measure. They would know if he wasn't alone. I have to go, he said. Absolutely not. This is clearly a trap. Of course it's a trap. But look at what they've done so far. They painted Sarah's murder before it happened. They painted Harold's death before it happened. They painted my death. He gestured to the third painting. Maybe it hasn't happened yet because they need me to come to them. Maybe if I don't show up, they'll just start killing random people until I do. Detective Hawthorne started to argue, but Marcus was already heading for the door. Just promise me, he called back, when this is over, destroy those paintings. All of them. Don't let anyone else see that smile. The gallery was dark when Marcus arrived at 11:55 p.m. He'd given Detective Hawthorne the security codes, knowing she'd have teams positioned around the building despite his instructions to come alone. The street lights cast familiar shadows through the windows, making the space feel like one of the painted crime scenes. At exactly midnight, Marcus heard footsteps from his office. Slow, deliberate steps like someone who had all the time in the world. He followed the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. The office was illuminated by several easels, each holding a painting that seemed to glow with its own light. But these weren't crime scenes. These were portraits. Dozens of them showing faces Marcus didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all with expressions of absolute terror. And standing behind each figure in every painting was the same smiling presence. "You appreciate my work," said a voice from the shadows. It was cultured, almost gentle, with a faint trace of an accent Marcus couldn't place. "That's why I chose you." David Henderson was talented, but he lacked vision. He painted what he saw. "I paint what will be." A figure stepped into the light and Marcus's breath caught. It was a woman, perhaps 40, with graying hair and paint-stained fingers. She looked perfectly ordinary except for her smile, that impossible, too-wide smile that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of her face. "David discovered my work by accident," she continued, setting up a fresh canvas on an easel. "He lived in the apartment across from one of my subjects. Saw me through the window and started painting what he witnessed. But he was weak. He tried to stop me, tried to expose me. So I taught him that some truths are too dangerous to tell. You killed him. I set him free. Do you know what it's like to see the future, Marcus? To know exactly when and how someone will die?" David thought he was painting my past crimes. He never realized he was painting futures I had already chosen. She began mixing colors on her palette, her movements precise and practiced. "You have something that belongs to me." David's paintings. His sister tried to hide them, but I found her. Just like I found Harold when he started asking questions about the Miller family. Just like I found Sarah when she began investigating the Henderson case for her newspaper. "The police know about you now," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They'll find you." "Will they?" She gestured to the portraits surrounding them. "Detective Hawthorne makes a lovely subject. Such expressive eyes. And Dr. Foster has the most interesting bone structure. I'm looking forward to painting them both." Marcus realized with horror that she was already several steps ahead. The portraits weren't of strangers. They were of everyone who had become involved in the case. Everyone who now knew about her existence. "You see, Marcus, I don't just paint the future. I create it. Each brushstroke is a choice, each color a possibility. When I paint someone's death, it becomes inevitable. The universe reshapes itself to match my vision." She turned back to her fresh canvas and began to paint. Marcus watched in fascination and terror as an image began to emerge, the gallery's interior, but different somehow. Darker. And there, in the corner of the composition, she began painting a figure slumped against the wall. "You want David's paintings?" Marcus said desperately. "They're in my safe. Take them." "Oh, I will. But first, you're going to help me complete my collection. You see, I've been documenting Portland's transformation for 7 years now. One death at a time, one painting at a time. The city is becoming exactly what I envision. A place where fear lives in every shadow, where people lock their doors and trust no one. Art doesn't just reflect reality, Marcus. True art creates it." As she painted, Marcus began to feel strange. His limbs grew heavy and a crushing weight settled on his chest. On the canvas, the figure in the corner was becoming more detailed. It wore Marcus's clothes, had Marcus. The Ravensheim Manor had stood empty for 30 years, its Gothic spires piercing the October sky like accusing fingers. Local teenagers whispered about it in hushed tones, daring each other to approach its rusted gates, but none had ever crossed the threshold, until tonight. "Come on, don't be such cowards," Maya taunted, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. She stood before the manor's imposing oak doors, her friends clustered behind her like nervous sheep. "It's just an old house." Jake nervously adjusted his glasses. "Maybe we should." "What? Go home and play video games?" Maya's laugh echoed off the stone walls. "We're seniors. This is our last Halloween together before college. Don't you want one real adventure?" The 5 friends had been inseparable since middle school. Maya, the fearless leader, Jake, the anxious intellectual, Samantha, the popular girl trying to prove she wasn't just a pretty face, Derek, the jock hiding his sensitivity, and quiet Lily, who rarely spoke but always listened. The manor's door creaked open at Maya's touch, as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale moonlight streaming through shattered windows. Their flashlights carved weak paths through the darkness, revealing furniture draped in moldering sheets and portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their movement. "God, it smells like death in here," Samantha whispered, covering her nose with her sleeve. "Probably just old wood and mildew," Jake said, though his voice shook slightly. He'd researched the manor's history obsessively. Built in 1847 by industrialist Cornelius Ravensheyer, it had been the site of unexplained disappearances for decades before being abandoned. The official records were sparse, but local folklore painted a darker picture. They moved through the foyer into what had once been a grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, and the parquet floor was warped with age and moisture. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, skin-like strips. "Look at this," Derek called from across the room. He stood before an ornate fireplace, its mantel carved with grotesque faces that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. "These carvings, they're not decorative. They look like they're screaming." Lily approached slowly, her usually pale face even whiter than usual. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Something's wrong. Can't you feel it?" Maya rolled her eyes. "The only thing wrong is your imagination. It's just an old..." Her words were cut off by a sound from above, a long, agonized wail that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The friends froze, their flashlights wavering. "What the hell was that?" Samantha's voice cracked. "Probably just the wind," Jake said, but he was already backing toward the door. "Old houses make all sorts of sounds." Another scream echoed through the manor, closer this time. It was undeniably human, or had been once. The sound was filled with such raw terror and pain that it made their skin crawl. "We need to leave. Now." Derek's athlete's instincts were screaming danger, but as he turned toward the exit, the massive oak door slammed shut with a thunderous boom that shook the entire building. Jake rushed to the door, pulling desperately at the handle. "It's locked. It won't budge." "There has to be another way out," Maya said, but her bravado was cracking. "Windows, back door, something." They split up to search, their flashlights creating a frantic dance of shadows. Every window they found was either bricked up or barred from the outside. The back door was sealed with rusted chains that looked like they'd been there for decades. As they regrouped in the ballroom, another scream pierced the air, this one from directly above them. It went on, rising and falling in waves of agony, until it finally cut off with a wet, choking sound. "Okay, that's definitely not the wind," Jake said, his scientific mind struggling to process what they were hearing. "Maybe someone else is trapped here," Samantha suggested hopefully. "Someone who needs help." But Lily was shaking her head. "No, it's not alive. Not anymore." Another scream, then another. They seemed to be coming from all around them now, the walls, the ceiling, even from beneath the floor. Each one was different, in a different voice, but all carried the same note of absolute terror. "The house," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with understanding. "It's not just abandoned. It's hungry." As if responding to her words, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath became visible, and frost began forming on the windows. The screams grew louder, overlapping into a hellish symphony. "We need to get upstairs," Maya said, surprising them all. "If someone's up there." "Are you insane?" Derek grabbed her arm. "Every horror movie ever made says don't go upstairs. This isn't a movie." Maya yanked free. "And I'm not leaving without knowing what's happening." But as they approached the grand staircase, the screaming stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the noise, thick and expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. Jake's flashlight illuminated something on the stairs. "Guys, look at this." Carved into each step were names and dates, scratched deep into the wood as if by fingernails. The dates went back decades, some from the 1960s, others more recent. The most recent was from 3 years ago, Tommy Walsh, October 31st, 2021. "Missing persons," Jake breathed. "These are all the people who disappeared near the manor." Samantha counted under her breath. "There are dozens of them." A new sound began then, not screaming but something worse. Breathing. Deep, ragged inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the house itself, as if the building had lungs hidden in its walls. "It's alive," Lily said simply. "The house is alive, and it's been feeding on terror for almost 2 centuries. The breathing grew louder, more labored, as if the manor was struggling with some great exertion. Then, impossibly, the walls began to pulse with a rhythmic throb, a massive alien heartbeat. The screams, Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. It doesn't just trap people. It feeds on their fear, their pain. That's why it keeps them alive, why it makes them scream. As if summoned by his words, ghostly figures began to materialize throughout the ballroom. Transparent at first, then gaining substance. Men, women, children, all with their mouths open in eternal screams that had no sound. Their eyes were hollow pits of madness, and their bodies bore the wounds of decades of torment. The friends huddled together as the spirits circled them like hungry vultures. Each ghost bore a name that matched one carved on the stairs, and their combined presence filled the air with a palpable aura of despair. "Why aren't they screaming now?" Samantha asked. Maya understood first. "Because we're here. Fresh meat. The house doesn't need them anymore." The realization hit them all at once. The manor had been waiting, patient as a spider in its web, for new victims to replace the old ones. The spirits weren't their enemies, they were trying to warn them. One ghost, a young woman in a 1970s dress, stepped forward. Her mouth moved silently, and Jake realized she was trying to tell them something. He focused on her lips, trying to read the words. "Don't scream," he translated. "She's saying don't scream." The ghost nodded frantically, then pointed to the others. Each spirit showed signs of torture, cuts, burns, broken bones, but their faces held the same desperate message. Silence was survival. But the house had other plans. The floor beneath their feet began to crack and split, revealing glimpses of a vast darkness below. From that darkness came sounds that tested their sanity, wet, slithering things moving in the depths, accompanied by a chorus of whispers in languages that predated human civilization. Derek, despite his size and strength, was the first to break. A strangled cry escaped his lips as something cold and slimy wrapped around his ankle from below. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough. The house responded immediately. The walls pulsed faster, the heartbeat rhythm accelerating to match Derek's terror. The temperature dropped even further, and the breathing sound became a satisfied sigh. More tendrils emerged from the cracks in the floor, not quite solid, not quite shadow, but hungry nonetheless. They wrapped around Derek's legs, his waist, his arms, lifting him off the ground as he struggled silently, tears streaming down his face. The others watched in horror as their friend was slowly pulled toward the growing chasm in the floor. Samantha opened her mouth to scream his name, but Maya slapped a hand over her lips. "Don't," Maya hissed. "It's what it wants." But Derek was disappearing into the darkness below, and the temptation to cry out was overwhelming. The house knew this, and it began to torture him more creatively, twisting his limbs at impossible angles, opening wounds that bled upward like crimson rain. Jake closed his eyes and began to recite mathematical equations under his breath, using logic to anchor his sanity. Samantha bit her own hand to keep from screaming, drawing blood. Lily had gone completely catatonic, staring at nothing. Maya, thinking fast, grabbed a piece of broken plaster and began to write on the dusty floor, "Fire." The others understood immediately. If the house was alive, it could be killed. An old wood burns beautifully. Working in desperate silence, they began gathering materials, broken furniture, moth-eaten curtains, anything flammable. Jake had a lighter in his pocket, a nervous habit he picked up despite being a non-smoker. But the house sensed their plan. The spirits around them became more agitated, pointing urgently at the ceiling. Looking up, they saw that the manor's original gas fixtures were still intact, and somehow, impossibly, gas was still flowing through the old pipes. One spark would turn the entire building into an inferno, taking them with it. The house had planned for this too, offering them only a choice between feeding it or burning with it. Derek's muffled sobs from below finally broke Lily's paralysis. Her friend was being tortured because of her silence, because she'd failed to warn them properly. The guilt was unbearable. "Derek!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the manor like a gunshot. The effect was instantaneous. The house shuddered with pleasure, its heartbeat thundering so loudly it was felt rather than heard. Every ghost in the room opened their mouths in a silent, sympathetic scream, their forms becoming more solid, more real. The tendrils released Derek, who fell into the chasm with a wet thud. But they were already reaching for Lily, drawn by her outburst like moths to flame. Maya made a decision that would haunt her forever. She grabbed Jake's lighter and flicked it to life, then threw it at the nearest gas fixture. The explosion was immediate and devastating. Flames raced along the gas lines with supernatural speed, igniting everything in their path. The house's scream, its real scream, was a sound that no human throat could produce, a wail of rage and hunger that shattered every remaining window. Maya, Jake, and Samantha found themselves thrown backward by the blast, through a window that hadn't been there moments before. They landed hard on the frost-covered ground outside, their clothes singed and their ears ringing. Behind them, Ravensheim Manor burned like a torch against the night sky. The flames seemed to move with purpose, forming faces and grasping hands before dissolving back into ordinary fire. The screaming continued for nearly an hour, not just the house's death cry, but the liberation of every soul it had trapped. Lily and Derek were never found. The official report blamed faulty gas lines and teenage recklessness. The manor burned to its foundation, leaving only a scorched crater that locals began to avoid. But Maya knew the truth, and it followed her into adulthood like a shadow. On quiet nights, she could still hear the house's heartbeat in her own chest, and sometimes when she passed old buildings, she could swear she heard the faintest echo of hungry breathing in their walls. The house that fed on screams was gone, but somewhere in the darkness, other hungry places waited for their chance to feast. The Driftwood Motel had seen better days, probably sometime in the 1960s, when its neon sign was new and its carpets weren't held together with duct tape and prayers. Now it squatted on the Oregon coast like a diseased animal, its paint peeling in the salt air and its vacancy sign flickering with the rhythm of a dying heart. Marcus Thorne pulled his rental car up to the motel office, windshield wipers struggling against the October rain. As a paranormal investigator with 15 years of experience, he'd stayed in plenty of dumps, but the Driftwood set a new standard for depressing. Still, that's what made it perfect for his purposes. The desk clerk was a skeletal man in his 70s, with the yellowish pallor of someone who'd spent too many years indoors. His name tag read Earl, and his smile revealed teeth that belonged in a museum. "You're the ghost hunter fella," Earl said, not bothering to make it a question. "Called about room 616. "That's right. I understand you've had some unusual occurrences." Earl's laugh was like sandpaper on wood. "Unusual? That's one way to put it. Nobody spent a full night in that room in 3 years. Guests check out in the middle of the night, screaming about things that ain't there. Or at least things nobody else can see. Have you experienced anything yourself?" "Me? Hell no. I don't go anywhere near that wing after dark." Earl slid a tarnished key across the counter. "Rooms at the end of the hall, 2nd floor. You sure about this?" Marcus pocketed the key. "I'm sure. I'll need access to any security footage from the area, and I'd like to speak with the housekeeping staff." "Ain't no security cameras on the 2nd floor," Earl said. "They kept malfunctioning. As for housekeeping, good luck getting Rosa to talk. She's the only one who'll even clean that room, and only during daylight hours." The motel's 2nd floor felt like a tomb. The hallway was lit by fluorescent tubes that flickered and hummed, casting everything in a sickly green glow. The carpet was a pattern of brown and orange that might have been fashionable during the Carter administration, now worn thin by decades of footsteps. Room 616 sat at the end of the hall like a period at the end of a death sentence. Marcus noted the gouges in the door frame, as if someone had clawed desperately at the wood. The rooms on either side, 614 and 618, were permanently sealed with yellow tape, their doors marked "out of order." The key turned easily, and the door swung open with a prolonged creak that sounded almost like a sigh. The room beyond was standard motel fare: 2 double beds with floral bedspreads, a small round table, a television older than most college students, and a window that looked out onto the churning Pacific. Marcus set down his equipment cases and began his routine setup. EMF detectors, temperature sensors, digital recorders, and night vision cameras, all the tools of his trade. But the centerpiece was his latest acquisition: a high-end digital camera capable of recording in complete darkness, with a memory card that could store up to 48 hours of continuous footage. As he worked, Marcus reviewed what he knew about room 616. The disappearances had started 3 years ago with a businessman named Robert Chin. According to the police report, Chin had checked in for a one-night stay and simply vanished. His car was still in the parking lot, his luggage still in the room, but Chin himself was gone. The window was locked from the inside and there was no other way out. Over the next 3 years, 5 more people had vanished from room 616. All were solo travelers, all checked in for single nights, and all left behind their belongings. The police had investigated each case thoroughly, but there was never any evidence of foul play. The victims simply ceased to exist. "That's where you're wrong," Marcus murmured to himself as he positioned his final camera. In his experience, people didn't just vanish. There was always a trail, always evidence. You just had to know where to look. He'd spent weeks researching the motel's history. Built in 1959 by a developer named Harold Vance, the Driftwood had been a modest success until the early 1990s, when complaints about Room 616 first surfaced. Guests reported nightmares, unexplained noises, and feelings of being watched. Most dismissed these as typical ghost stories, but Marcus had found something more concrete. In 1993, a guest named Timothy Walsh had been found dead in Room 616, his body positioned in front of the television in what appeared to be a ritualistic manner. His arms were spread wide, his eyes had been removed, and strange symbols were carved into his chest. The case was never solved, but Marcus suspected it was connected to the current disappearances. As night fell, Marcus settled in to wait. He'd brought enough coffee and energy drinks to stay alert all night, and his equipment would record everything even if he somehow fell asleep. At 11:47 p.m., the first anomaly occurred. The temperature in the room dropped 15 degrees in less than a minute. Marcus checked his thermometer, then his other sensors. The electromagnetic field was fluctuating wildly, and his digital recorders were picking up sounds below the range of human hearing. At 12:13 a.m., the television turned on by itself. The screen filled with static at first, but gradually an image began to form. It was security footage, black and white, grainy, with a timestamp from 3 years ago. Marcus recognized the room immediately. It was Room 616, but the furniture was arranged differently. On the screen, a middle-aged Asian man entered the room. Robert Chin, Marcus realized. The first victim. Chin set down his suitcase, loosened his tie, and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked tired but normal, just another business traveler at the end of a long day. Then Chin's head turned toward the television, as if he could see the same footage Marcus was watching. His expression changed from tired indifference to confusion, then to dawning horror. His mouth opened in what might have been a scream, but the footage had no sound. Chin stood up and walked toward the television, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. He reached toward the screen, and as his fingers made contact, the image on the television changed. Now Marcus was watching himself, sitting in the same chair, staring at the same television. But the timestamp on the footage showed it was from 2 hours in the future. In the image, Marcus looked terrified, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. The real Marcus felt his stomach lurch. He was watching his own future, and it didn't look good. On the screen, the future Marcus stood up and walked toward the television, just as Chen had done. His movements were the same jerky puppet dance, and his face held the same expression of helpless horror. As the future Marcus reached for the screen, the image changed again. This time it showed a woman Marcus didn't recognize, blonde, middle-aged, wearing a nurse's uniform. The timestamp was from 2 years ago. Like Chin and the future Marcus, she was walking toward a television, her movements controlled by some invisible force. The pattern was becoming clear. The television was showing a loop of victims, each one drawn to the screen by whatever malevolent force controlled Room 616. And now Marcus was part of that loop. He tried to stand up to break the pattern, but found his legs wouldn't obey. His body was moving on its own, drawn by the same puppet strings that had controlled Chen and the others. Step by step, he approached the television, fighting against the compulsion with every fiber of his will. The screen showed him another victim now, a young man in his 20s wearing a college sweatshirt. The timestamp was from last year. The young man was reaching for the screen, his face twisted in terror, and as his fingers touched the glass, Marcus saw what happened next. The young man didn't disappear. He was pulled into the television, his body stretching and distorting as it was sucked through the screen like water down a drain. For a moment, his face pressed against the inside of the glass, mouth open in a silent scream, before he was pulled deeper into whatever electronic hell lay beyond. Marcus was close enough now to see his own reflection in the television screen, superimposed over the image of the college student. He was reaching for the glass, just like all the others, his hand trembling as it approached the surface. But Marcus had one advantage the other victims hadn't possessed. He was a professional paranormal investigator, and he'd learned to function despite fear. With tremendous effort, he forced his left hand into his pocket and activated the emergency beacon he always carried, a device that would alert his research partner and the local authorities if he failed to check in. The beacon's activation seemed to disrupt whatever force was controlling him. Marcus felt the compulsion weaken, and he threw himself backward, away from the television. He hit the floor hard, his equipment cases scattering around him. The television screen flickered and went dark, but Marcus could still hear sounds coming from within it. Muffled screams, desperate pounding, the sound of many voices calling for help. The missing victims weren't gone. They were trapped inside the television, in some digital purgatory where they would remain conscious but powerless for eternity. Marcus scrambled for his camera, checking the footage he'd recorded. What he saw made his blood run cold. The timestamp on his camera showed that the entire encounter had lasted only 3 minutes, but he'd experienced nearly an hour of subjective time. More disturbing, the footage showed him sitting motionless in his chair for the entire 3 minutes, never moving toward the television at all. Either the camera had malfunctioned, or the supernatural force in room 616 was capable of manipulating perception itself, making victims believe they were being drawn to the television while their bodies remained stationary. But if that was true, what had happened to the missing people? Marcus examined the television more closely. It was an old CRT model, probably from the 1980s, heavy and bulky with a thick glass screen. But as he looked at it, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The screen wasn't quite smooth. There were subtle irregularities in the surface, like faces pressed against glass from the inside. He grabbed a flashlight and shone it on the screen at different angles. The irregularities became more visible, and Marcus realized he was looking at human faces, dozens of them, all trapped within the glass itself. Their expressions were frozen in eternal terror, their mouths open in screams that would never be heard. The television was more than a viewing device. It was a prison, a supernatural trap that had been collecting victims for decades. The missing people hadn't been pulled into a digital realm. They had been transformed into part of the television itself, their consciousness imprisoned within the glass while their bodies were somehow integrated into the device's structure. Marcus's research had uncovered references to similar phenomena in occult literature, objects that served as gateways between dimensions, powered by human suffering and sustained by the life force of their victims. The television in room 616 was such an object, and it had been feeding on travelers for at least 30 years. But why room 616 specifically? Marcus examined the room more carefully, looking for clues. Behind the television he found a loose floorboard. Beneath it was a collection of objects that made him recoil in horror. Dozens of identification cards, driver's licenses, and personal items from people who had stayed in the room over the decades. At the bottom of the cache was a leather journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. The journal belonged to Harold Vance, the motel's original owner, and its contents revealed the truth about room 616. Vance had been a member of an occult society obsessed with achieving immortality through supernatural means. He and his associates had built the motel as a cover for their experiments, with room 616 serving as their primary laboratory. They had purchased the television from a dealer in cursed objects, believing it would help them communicate with the dead. Instead, the television had begun trapping anyone who looked into it too long, feeding on their life force and gradually becoming more powerful. Vance's associates had been among the first victims, but Vance himself had been spared, not through any special protection, but because he was the one who controlled the device. The journal's final entries revealed Vance's growing madness as he realized what he had unleashed. The television didn't just trap its victims, it made them part of itself, adding their knowledge and memories to its own supernatural intelligence. With each new victim, the device became more cunning, more capable of luring prey to their doom. Vance had died in 1994 according to public records, but Marcus suspected the truth was more complex. The man had likely been consumed by his own creation, becoming part of the television's collective consciousness while his body withered away. Now Marcus faced a terrible choice. He could try to destroy the television, potentially freeing the trapped victims but also risking his own life. Or he could flee, leaving the device to claim future victims while he lived with the knowledge of what he'd discovered. The choice was made for him when the television turned on again, this time showing a little girl in a princess costume. The timestamp indicated the footage was from next week, Halloween night. The girl was being led into room 616 by someone whose face was obscured by shadows, someone who knew exactly what the television was capable of. Marcus realized that the device didn't just randomly trap victims, it was being fed by an accomplice, someone who had access to the motel and knowledge of its dark secret. Earl, the desk clerk, had been too eager to rent out the haunted room, too casual about the disappearances. The truth hit Marcus like a physical blow. Earl wasn't just the desk clerk, he was Harold Vance, kept alive by the television's power for over 30 years. The device had granted him a form of immortality, but at the cost of serving as its procurer, luring victims to their doom. The television screen flickered again, and Marcus saw Earl's true face staring back at him. Not the elderly man from the front desk, but something ancient and hungry, its eyes reflecting the trapped souls within the glass. The thing that had once been Harold Vance smiled, revealing teeth like broken glass. "You understand now," it said, its voice coming from the television speakers but also from the walls themselves. "You see what I've built here? A perfect feeding ground, an endless supply of prey. And now you'll join them." The compulsion hit Marcus again, stronger this time. His legs carried him toward the television despite his desperate resistance. But as he approached the screen, he saw something that gave him hope. His emergency beacon was still broadcasting, and through the window he could see the flashing lights of police cars in the parking lot. His research partner had received the signal and called for help. In moments, the room would be full of people, and the television would have more victims than it could handle at once. The overload might be enough to disrupt its power. Marcus grabbed the heaviest object he could find, a lamp made of solid ceramic, and hurled it at the television screen. The glass cracked but didn't shatter, and the faces within writhed in agony as their prison was damaged. Earl's screams echoed from the speakers as Marcus grabbed a chair and brought it down on the television again and again. With each impact, more faces became visible in the glass, and their expressions changed from terror to hope. The television finally shattered on the seventh blow, and the room filled with a sound like 100 voices sighing in relief. A cold wind rushed through the broken screen, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers and sunlight, the essence of lives that had been trapped for decades. Earl's final scream cut off abruptly, and when the police burst through the door moments later, they found Marcus standing over the ruins of an old television, his hands cut and bleeding from the broken glass. The official report stated that Marcus had suffered a psychological breakdown and destroyed property in a fit of paranoid delusion. The pieces of the television were disposed of as electronic waste, and room 616 was permanently sealed. But Marcus knew the truth. In the weeks that followed, missing person cases from across the region were quietly closed as families received word that their loved ones had been found. The explanations were always mundane: amnesia, voluntary disappearance, clerical errors, but Marcus recognized the pattern. The souls trapped in the television had been freed, and somehow, impossibly, they had found their way back to life. Not all of them, perhaps, and not all of them whole, but enough to prove that even the darkest supernatural prison could be broken. The Driftwood Motel was demolished 6 months later, and a small park was built on the site. But sometimes, on foggy nights, visitors report seeing a flickering light in the mist, like the glow of an old television screen, waiting patiently for someone to look too long into its hypnotic depths. Maple Street was the kind of suburban paradise that existed only in real estate brochures and insurance commercials. White picket fences bordered perfectly manicured lawns, children's bicycles lay scattered on driveways like promises of happy tomorrows, and the houses themselves stood in neat rows like soldiers at attention, each one a testament to the American dream. During the day, Maple Street hummed with the gentle chaos of family life. Dogs barked, lawnmowers rumbled, children played in yards while their parents called out reminders about sunscreen and stranger danger. It was normal, safe, comfortable. Everything the Hartwell family had been looking for when they moved to Willowbrook 6 months ago. But after midnight, Maple Street became something else entirely. Sarah Hartwell first noticed it during her 3rd week in the new house. She'd always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest sound, but what woke her that night wasn't noise, it was the absence of it. The world outside her bedroom window had become so quiet that the silence seemed to press against the glass like a living thing. She'd gotten up to investigate, padding barefoot to the window that overlooked their front yard and the street beyond. What she saw made no sense. The streetlights were still on, casting their warm yellow glow over the pavement, but everything else was wrong. No cars passed by. No cats prowled between the houses. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the trees as motionless as photographs. The silence was so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing through her veins. It was as if the entire world had been put on pause, frozen in a moment between one breath and the next. But then she heard it, a sound that made her skin crawl and her hands gripped the windowsill until her knuckles went white. From the house directly across the street, the old Victorian that had stood empty since they'd moved in, came a sound that no living throat should be able to produce. It started as a whimper, high and thin, like a child trying not to cry. Then it grew, becoming a wail of such pure terror and pain that Sarah's rational mind tried to reject it. The sound went on, rising and falling in waves that seemed to physically press against her eardrums. Mixed with the wailing were other sounds, sharp, rhythmic impacts that could only be one thing. The sound of a blade cutting through flesh and bone, over and over again, punctuated by wet, slapping sounds that made Sarah's stomach lurch. She wanted to call the police, to run across the street and help whoever was being hurt, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The sounds were too wrong, too impossible. The house across the street had been empty for months. The real estate sign in the front yard was still there, still promising prime location and motivated seller. The torture session, for that's what it had to be, went on for exactly 1 hour. Sarah knew because she watched the digital clock on her nightstand, its red numbers seeming to mock her with their slow progression. At 12:59, the sounds cut off abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Immediately, the normal sounds of night returned. A car drove by, its engine rumbling softly. A dog barked 3 streets over. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak tree in their front yard. The world had resumed its natural rhythm, as if the last hour had never happened. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she forced herself to walk across the street and examine the empty house. In daylight, it looked perfectly normal, a bit run down perhaps, with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds, but nothing sinister. The windows were boarded up, and the front door bore multiple "No trespassing" signs. There was no evidence of any disturbance, no signs that anyone had been inside. Sarah spent the day researching the house online, digging through public records and newspaper archives. What she found made her stomach turn. The house had been the site of a brutal murder-suicide in 1987. Ronald Kellerman, a seemingly ordinary accountant, had killed his wife and 3 children with a carving knife before taking his own life. The murders had been particularly savage, with evidence suggesting that Kellerman had tortured his family for hours before finally killing them. The house had stood empty ever since. Several attempts had been made to sell it, but every potential buyer had backed out at the last minute, citing bad feelings and disturbing sensations. The few brave souls who had tried to renovate it reported strange sounds and unexplained phenomena that drove them away within days. Sarah told herself it was just her imagination, that the stress of moving and starting over had made her mind play tricks on her. But when midnight came again, she found herself standing at the window waiting. At 12:01 a.m., the world went silent again. And at 12:02, the screaming began. This time Sarah was ready. She had her phone recording, her camera ready, and a notebook to document everything. If she was losing her mind, at least she'd have proof. If something supernatural was happening, maybe she could find a way to stop it. The screams were different tonight. More desperate, more raw. Sarah could distinguish individual voices now. A woman's panicked pleas, a child's terrified sobs, another child's whimpered prayers. Her hands shook as she tried to focus her camera on the empty house, but the lens revealed nothing but darkness behind the boarded windows. The playback on her phone showed only silence. The recording had captured nothing but her own ragged breathing. But Sarah knew what she was hearing. She knew it was real, even if she couldn't prove it. And tonight she thought she understood something else. The timing was too precise, too ritualistic. This wasn't random. This was an anniversary. She checked her notes. The murders had occurred on March 15, 1987. Today was March 15, 2024. Exactly 37 years later. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane just a week ago. She was going to break into the house. The real estate lockbox was old and corroded, but Sarah had learned to pick locks in college, a skill she'd acquired during a rebellious phase that now seemed like destiny. The house groaned as she stepped inside, the floorboards settling under her weight like tired bones. The interior was a time capsule of horror. Police tape still clung to door frames. Chalk outlines, faded but still visible, marked where bodies had been found. The walls bore dark stains that Sarah tried very hard not to think about. She found the basement last. The stairs creaked ominously as she descended, her flashlight beam dancing across stone walls that seemed to absorb the light. The basement was smaller than she'd expected, with a low ceiling that made her feel claustrophobic. But it was what she found in the corner that made her blood freeze. An altar. Crude but unmistakable, made from stacked cinder blocks and topped with a wooden board. Dark stains covered its surface, and carved into the wood were symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around the altar, the concrete floor was etched with a circle of the same disturbing symbols. But it was the photographs that made Sarah's knees buckle. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls like a gallery of nightmares. Not just the Kellerman family, but others. Families from different decades, different places, all bearing the same expression of absolute terror. And in the center of it all, a newspaper clipping from 1987, Accountant Slaughter's family in ritual killing. The article described details that hadn't been in the online reports. Ronald Kellerman hadn't just snapped, he'd been following instructions. Instructions found in his handwriting, detailing a ritual that promised to open the door between worlds and grant him dominion over death itself. The ritual required 5 deaths, a father, a mother, and 3 children, performed during the midnight hour on the anniversary of the first successful attempt. But Kellerman had made a mistake. He'd killed himself before completing the final step, trapping himself and his family in an endless loop of torment. Every year, on the anniversary, the ritual played out again. The same screams, the same torture, the same deaths. But never the final step that would free them or grant Kellerman his twisted apotheosis. Sarah's hands shook as she read the final paragraph of Kellerman's notes. The ritual must be completed by one who witnesses but does not participate. One who hears but does not flee. One who knows but chooses to act. She looked at her watch. 11:47 p.m. Sarah had 2 choices. She could run, leave the house and never return, maybe even move away from Maple Street entirely. The torture would continue, but it wouldn't be her problem anymore. Or she could stay and complete the ritual. Free the Kellerman family from their eternal torment and prevent any future witnesses from being drawn into the nightmare. But completing the ritual meant becoming the 5th death. The willing sacrifice that would end the cycle. At 11:59, Sarah made her choice. She picked up the ancient carving knife that lay on the altar, its blade still sharp despite the decades. The screaming from upstairs had begun again, but this time it sounded different. Hopeful, almost, as if the tormented souls knew their ordeal was finally coming to an end. As the clock struck midnight, Sarah Hartwell raised the knife and spoke the words written in Ronald Kellerman's fevered handwriting. The basement filled with light and the screaming stopped forever. The next morning, neighbors found the front door of the old Victorian standing open for the first time in 37 years. The for sale sign had blown down during the night, and the morning sun streamed through windows that were no longer boarded up. Inside the house was clean. The stains were gone, the police tape had vanished, and the chalk outlines had been erased. In the basement, the altar had crumbled to dust, and the photographs had yellowed and faded until they were nothing but blank paper. The only sign that anything had happened was a small notation in the local newspaper's obituary section. Sarah Hartwell, 34, beloved wife and mother, passed peacefully in her sleep. She will be remembered for her kindness, her courage, and her willingness to help others, no matter the cost. The house sold within a week to a young family with 3 children. They reported that it was the most peaceful place they'd ever lived, and their children often spoke of the nice lady who watched over them at night, making sure they were safe and sound. On Maple Street, the nights were quiet again. But sometimes, if you listened carefully in the hour after midnight, you could hear something new. The sound of children laughing, playing games that living children had long forgotten, their joy echoing through the darkness like a promise that some sacrifices are worth making. And in the basement of the old Victorian, in the space where an altar once stood, 5 small lights danced in the darkness. A family reunited at last, their guardian angel watching over them with the same fierce love that had driven her to set them free. The silence after midnight was no longer empty. It was full of peace. The wind howled through the pine trees as Sarah Martinez pulled into the gravel driveway of Blackrock Lodge. The rustic cabin held decades of memories, late-night card games, ghost stories, and Jennifer's infectious laughter that could light up any room. Tonight was Jennifer's 35th birthday, a reunion of their college friend group. Sarah grabbed her bag, noting several cars already parked outside. She was fashionably late as always. "Sarah, you made it." Jennifer pulled her into a tight hug at the door. "I was starting to worry you'd chicken out." Inside, the lodge was exactly as Sarah remembered: exposed beams, stone fireplace, mounted deer heads watching with glass eyes. The familiar faces gathered around. Marcus Chin by the fireplace, David Rodriguez with expensive glasses, Amy Patterson with her Instagram-perfect smile, and Tony Brennan, barely aged since college. "This is so surreal," Amy said, holding up her phone. "When was the last time we were all together?" 13 years ago, David said, checking his watch. "God, we're getting old." Jennifer raised her wine glass. "That's exactly why I wanted to do this. We all drift apart, but this place holds our best memories." As the evening progressed, Jennifer stood up with a piece of yellowed paper. "I found our old RSVP list from my 21st birthday party here. Look, everyone who's here tonight was on that original list." She read aloud: Sarah Martinez, Marcus Chin, David Rodriguez, Amy Patterson, Tony Brennan, and me. "What about Kevin Walsh and Lisa Thornton?" Marcus asked slowly. "They were definitely at that party." Jennifer frowned. You're right, but they're not on here. That's strange. Tony's expression grew somber. Speaking of them, did you guys hear? Kevin died last month. Car accident. And Lisa died of cancer 6 months ago. The room fell silent. The coincidence felt unsettling. Their missing friends were dead, and only those on the list had survived to attend tonight. Sarah studied the paper more carefully. Jennifer, this handwriting looks recent. Are you sure this is from 13 years ago? Before Jennifer could answer, David tried the front door. Guys, the door's stuck. They tried every exit, all locked from the outside. No cell service. The landline was dead. Through the windows they could see distant lights, proving the problem was isolated to the lodge. Then came the knocking, 3 measured raps at the front door. David found the door suddenly unlocked and discovered a piece of paper on the porch, weighted with a rock. This list was written in different handwriting. Sarah Martinez, 1. Marcus Chin, 2. David Rodriguez, 3. Amy Patterson, 4. Tony Brennan, 5. Jennifer Walsh, 6". Walsh? Sarah said. Your name isn't Walsh. It was, Jennifer whispered. Before my parents divorced. That was my name in college. The numbers, Amy said. What do they mean? Before anyone could answer, the lights went out. In the chaos that followed, they heard footsteps upstairs. Someone else was in the house. They fled to the basement with flashlights, but the footsteps followed. A man's voice called down, "Please don't be afraid. I just want to talk." A middle-aged man appeared at the bottom of the stairs, graying hair, wire-rimmed glasses, completely non-threatening. "My name is Robert Walsh," he said sadly. "I believe you knew my children, Lisa and Kevin." The pieces clicked. Lisa Thornton and Kevin Walsh were your children? Robert nodded. They took their mother's name after our divorce, just like you did, Jennifer. They spoke of you all often, their important college friends. His expression hardened. The ones who abandoned them when real life got difficult. We didn't abandon them, David protested. We just lost touch. Did you? Because you all stayed in touch with each other. You're here celebrating together. But Lisa died alone. Kevin died alone. None of you were at their funerals. Robert's voice remained calm but steely. Lisa tried to reach out, Jennifer. Wedding invitations, birth announcements, Christmas cards. You never responded. Kevin asked Marcus for help finding work. You never called back. The guilt hit like physical blows. Sarah remembered deleting an unread message from Lisa, assuming it was spam. Lisa died wondering why her friends had forgotten her, Robert continued. Kevin struggled with depression, drinking, reaching out for help that never came. He pulled out the numbered list. This is the order in which my children tried to reconnect with you. Sarah first. Lisa messaged you when she was diagnosed. Marcus second. Kevin called about his job loss. David third. Lisa's wedding invitation. Amy fourth. Lisa tried connecting on LinkedIn. Tony fifth. Kevin reached out during his divorce. Jennifer last. Lisa sent you a card when her first child was born. Each revelation was a knife twist of recognition and shame. Robert walked to a workbench and picked up a remote control. Now you'll experience what they did. The isolation. The abandonment. He pressed a button and they heard mechanical grinding. The front door is unlocked. You can leave any time. But every time someone leaves, someone else dies. He held up the list. Sarah leaves first, Jennifer dies. Sarah and Marcus leave, Jennifer and Tony die. Simple mathematics. That's insane, Tony said. Is it? My daughter's last words to me were about loneliness, how the people she'd loved had forgotten she existed. Robert headed for the stairs. So choose. Save yourselves or save each other. How do we know you're telling the truth? Sarah called. Robert paused. You don't. Maybe I'm bluffing. The only way to find out is to test it. After he left, panic set in. Tony backed toward the stairs, eyes darting. He's bluffing. He has to be. We stick together, Marcus said firmly. But Tony was already moving. Sorry, but I'm not dying for people who don't give a shit about me. He bolted up the stairs. They heard the front door open and close, then an agonized scream from outside, high-pitched, gurgling, then dragging sounds. Silence. Jennifer collapsed, sobbing. Tony's dead because he tried to leave. Hours crawled by. At dawn, Robert's voice called down, Good morning. Tell me, have any of you thought about Tony this morning? Or have you already started forgetting him? The terrible truth was they hadn't. Focused on survival, Tony was already fading from their minds. Here's day 2, Robert continued. The house has 5 rooms upstairs. Each has food, water, comfort. You can each take a room and wait this out. But the rooms lock from outside once you enter. And every day at sunset, one room becomes a death trap. You get to vote on which one. The room assignments were based on reverse alphabetical order. Sarah, room 1. Marcus, room 2. Jennifer, room 3. David, room 4. Amy, room 5. Democracy in action, Robert said. The majority rules. One by one they climbed upstairs and entered their prisons. The doors locked with solid clicks. As sunset approached, the intercom crackled. Time to vote. Write a room number on the paper provided. The room with the most votes becomes tonight's death trap. Sarah stared at the blank paper, pen trembling. Vote for another room and she was murdering a friend. Vote for her own room and she was committing suicide. Don't vote and she might die anyway. She heard paper sliding under doors throughout the house. The votes have been counted, Robert announced. Tonight's death trap is room 4. David's room. David's screams echoed through the house. Terror, betrayal, then mechanical sounds and more screaming. Then silence. Sleep well, Robert said. Tomorrow we'll do this again. Sarah curled up on her bed, weeping. She had participated in murder and would have to do it again tomorrow. The real horror wasn't Robert Walsh or his death trap. It was discovering what people would do to survive, how quickly love and loyalty crumbled when faced with mortality. She had 3 more votes to cast over the next 3 nights. And she was already wondering who she would sacrifice next. Outside, the night whispered with shadows and the weight of abandoned friendships. While somewhere in the darkness, Robert Walsh waited to see if they would prove his point about the disposable nature of human connection. The game had only just begun. The Victorian house on Elm Street stood like a forgotten memory against the twilight sky. Its weathered blue shutters hung slightly askew, and ivy crept up the brick foundation in wild, untamed patterns. But to the Morrison family, it represented a fresh start. A place where they could rebuild after losing everything in the divorce. Rebecca Morrison set down the last box in what would become the living room, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her 8-year-old son Danny sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, already unpacking his collection of toy dinosaurs with the focused determination only children possessed. "Mom, do you hear that?" Danny asked suddenly, his head tilted toward the wall. Rebecca paused, listening. The old house creaked and settled around them, but that was normal for a building over a century old. "Hear what, sweetheart?" The scratching. Like something's trying to get out. A chill ran down Rebecca's spine, but she forced a smile. "It's probably just mice in the walls. Old houses have mice sometimes. We'll call an exterminator tomorrow." Danny nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "It doesn't sound like mice, Mom. It sounds like talking." "Talking?" Rebecca knelt beside her son, studying his serious face. Since the divorce, Danny had been prone to anxiety and strange fears. The therapist said it was normal. Children often created imaginary threats when their world felt unstable. "Yeah, like whispers. Really quiet whispers." Danny placed his hand flat against the wall. "They're saying something, but I can't understand the words." Rebecca placed her own hand on the wall, feeling only the cool smoothness of old plaster. "I don't hear anything, honey. Maybe you're just tired from the move. Why don't we order pizza and watch a movie tonight?" But as they settled in for their first night in the house, Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of wind through the windows seemed amplified. When she finally fell asleep on the air mattress in her new bedroom, her dreams were filled with scratching sounds and voices just beyond the edge of understanding. The next morning, Danny was already awake when Rebecca came downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing with his crayons. When she looked at his artwork, her blood ran cold. The drawings showed their house, but the walls were transparent. Inside, between the wooden beams and plaster, were dozens of small figures, stick people with X's for eyes, all pressing their hands against the interior walls as if trying to push through. "Danny, what is this?" "It's the people in the walls, Mom. They showed me last night." Danny looked up at her with those wide, innocent eyes. They'd been waiting a really long time for someone to let them out. Rebecca's hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "Showed you how?" "In my dreams. But I don't think they were really dreams." Danny picked up a red crayon and began adding more figures to his drawing. "They said they used to live here before. A long, long time ago. But something bad happened and now they're stuck." "Danny, listen to me." Rebecca knelt beside her son's chair. "There are no people in the walls. Sometimes when we're in a new place, our imagination can play tricks on us." But even as she said the words, she heard it, A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere inside the wall behind the stove. It was rhythmic, almost like Morse code. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pause. Scratch, scratch. Danny heard it too. His eyes went wide and he pointed at the wall. See? They're trying to talk to us. Rebecca's rational mind searched for explanations. Mice. Settling wood. Old pipes. Anything but the impossible thing her son was suggesting. But as the scratching continued, growing more insistent, she found herself backing toward the kitchen door. Get your shoes, Danny. We're going to the library. At the Willowbrook Public Library, Rebecca dove into the historical records while Danny played quietly in the children's section. What she found made her stomach twist into knots. The house had been built in 1887 by a man named Ezra Blackwood. In 1923, during a particularly harsh winter, Ezra had taken in several families who'd lost their homes to a fire. But the spring thaw had brought tragedy. Carbon monoxide from a faulty furnace had killed all 7 of the house's occupants in their sleep. Their bodies hadn't been discovered for weeks. The newspaper article from 1923 was brief but chilling. Local authorities report that the victims appeared to have clawed at the walls in their final moments, though medical experts believe this was merely a physiological response to oxygen deprivation. Rebecca stared at the grainy photograph of the house from nearly a century ago. It looked almost identical to how it appeared now, except for one detail: there were faces visible in some of the windows. Pale, desperate faces pressed against the glass. That evening, Rebecca tried to convince herself that the library research was just feeding her paranoia. She made dinner, helped Danny with his homework, and read him a bedtime story. But as night fell, the sounds began again. This time it wasn't just scratching. It was tapping, deliberate, purposeful tapping that seemed to follow them from room to room. When Rebecca walked through the hallway, the tapping moved along the wall beside her. When she stopped, it stopped. When she moved again, it resumed. Mom? Danny's voice was small and frightened. He stood at the top of the stairs in his superhero pajamas. They're getting louder. Rebecca climbed the stairs and took her son's hand. It was ice cold. Come sleep in my room tonight, okay? But even with Danny curled up beside her, sleep wouldn't come. The tapping had become a symphony of sounds, scratching, knocking, and something that sounded disturbingly like whispering. Rebecca strained to make out words, but the voices seemed to speak in some language just beyond comprehension. Around 3 in the morning, Danny sat up suddenly in bed. His eyes were wide open, but Rebecca could tell he was still asleep. They want to show us something, Danny said in a voice that didn't quite sound like his own. They want to show us where they hid. Danny? Rebecca shook her son gently. Danny, wake up. But Danny was already climbing out of bed, his movements mechanical and strange. He walked to the bedroom wall and pressed both hands against it. Here, he said. They're right here. The wall where Danny touched began to feel warm under Rebecca's fingertips. Then, impossibly, the wallpaper started to peel away in long strips, revealing something that made Rebecca's scream catch in her throat. Behind the wallpaper, carved directly into the plaster, were dozens of handprints. Small ones, large ones, all pressed deep into the wall as if the plaster had been soft when they were made. And in the center of the handprints, scratched in letters barely visible in the dim light, were words. Help US remember. Danny suddenly gasped and stumbled backward, fully awake now. Mom? What happened? Why is the wall? Rebecca grabbed her son and pulled him away from the wall. The handprints were still there, real and undeniable. But as she watched, the wallpaper began to slowly curl back into place, covering the impossible sight. We're leaving, Rebecca whispered. Right now. Get your things. But as they rushed to pack their few belongings, the sounds in the walls grew frantic. The scratching became pounding, the whispers became wails. The entire house seemed to shake with the force of whatever was trapped inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. In the stillness, Rebecca heard Danny's voice, small and sad. They don't want us to go, Mom. They've been alone for so long. Rebecca looked at her son, then at the house that had promised them a fresh start. She thought about the families who had died here nearly a century ago, forgotten and lost. She thought about the desperation it would take to leave such permanent marks in the walls. What do they want, Danny? To be remembered, Danny said simply. To not be forgotten anymore. Rebecca took a deep breath, her heart pounding. Then maybe we should listen. As the sun rose over Willowbrook, Rebecca Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of running from the voices in the walls, she would learn their stories. She would remember their names. And perhaps in doing so, she would finally give them the peace they had been searching for all these years. The house on Elm Street was no longer just a building where a family lived. It had become a bridge between the past and present, where the living and the dead could finally find understanding. And in the walls, for the first time in nearly a century, there was silence. Detective Marcus Sullivan had seen enough horror in his 23 years on the force to believe that nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The fourth body lay sprawled across the grimy alley behind Mercado's Deli, limbs twisted at impossible angles like a discarded marionette. Rain drummed against the fire escapes above, washing diluted blood toward the storm drains and pink rivulets. Marcus crouched beside the corpse, his flashlight beam dancing across the victim's face, or what remained of it. Same as the others? Officer Jenny Reeves asked, her voice barely audible over the downpour. Marcus nodded grimly. The killer's signature was unmistakable. Every tooth had been meticulously extracted, leaving behind a gaping, bloody cavity where the victim's smile should have been. The precision was surgical, almost reverent. No other injuries, no signs of struggle beyond the obvious terror frozen in the victim's eyes. "That's for this month," Marcus muttered, standing slowly. His knees protested he was getting too old for this. All different ages, different backgrounds. No connection except the teeth, Jenny finished. Marcus's phone buzzed. Dr. Sarah Chin, the medical examiner, had sent her preliminary report on victim number 3. He scrolled through the clinical language until one phrase made his blood run cold. Asterisk extraction performed post-mortem with dental-grade precision tools. Suspect likely has medical or dental training. Asterisk. But it was the final line that made his hands shake. Asterisk, small traces of dental cement found in extraction sites, suggesting teeth were being prepared for mounting or display. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. What is it? The killer's keeping them. The teeth. He's collecting them. 3 days later, Marcus sat in his cramped office, walls papered with crime scene photos, victim profiles, and red string connecting impossible dots. The faces of the dead stared back at him. Maria Santos, 34, kindergarten teacher. David Kim, 67, retired accountant. Ashley Morgan, 19, college student. Robert Fletcher, 42, insurance adjuster. No pattern. No logic. Just the teeth, always the teeth. His computer chimed, another message from Dr. Chin. This one contained detailed dental records for all 4 victims. Marcus opened the file and immediately noticed something strange. He pulled out a magnifying glass and studied the x-rays more carefully. The extractions weren't random. Victim 1, upper left molars removed. Victim 2, lower right canines. Victim 3, upper front incisors. Victim 4, lower left premolars. Marcus grabbed a piece of paper and began sketching a crude dental chart, marking which teeth had been taken. A pattern emerged, one that made his stomach lurch. The killer wasn't just collecting teeth, he was assembling a complete set, methodically harvesting specific specimens from different victims. Like pieces of a puzzle. His phone rang, jolting him from his horrified realization. Sullivan. Detective, we've got another one. Jenny's voice was strained. 5th victim. Mercy General Hospital parking garage, level B2. Marcus was already reaching for his coat. On my way. The hospital's underground parking garage felt like a tomb. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly shadows between concrete pillars. The victim lay near a blue Honda Civic, car keys still clutched in one hand. Dr. Amanda Price, 45, oral surgeon. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He knelt beside the body, noting the familiar handiwork. But this time something was different. The killer had been more thorough, removing not just specific teeth but also. Marcus's flashlight illuminated something that made his gorge rise. Bite marks. Fresh ones encircling the victim's lips and gums. He's escalating, Dr. Chin said, appearing beside him with her medical kit. This isn't just about the teeth anymore. Look at this. She pointed to the victim's left hand. Clutched in the fingers was a small piece of yellowed paper, stained with blood. Marcus carefully extracted it and unfolded the fragment. It was part of an old photograph, black and white, probably from the 1950s. The image showed the edge of what appeared to be a family portrait. 3 partial figures in formal clothing, their faces mostly torn away. But what made Marcus's blood freeze was the detail visible at the bottom of the photo. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, smiling widely at the camera. His teeth were perfect, gleaming white in the vintage photograph. But someone had taken a red pen and carefully circled each tooth, numbering them from 1 to 32. He's following a blueprint, Marcus whispered. Back at the station, Marcus spread the photograph fragment on his desk under a magnifying lamp. The image quality was poor, but he could make out more details. The boy's clothing suggested this photo was taken in the late 1940s or early 1950s. Behind him, barely visible, were the silhouettes of what appeared to be adult family members. Marcus scanned the photo into his computer and enhanced the image. As the pixels sharpened, he began to make out more of the scene. The family was posed in front of what looked like a dentist's office. He could see part of a sign in the background, "Dentist," and below it, "Millie Dental." His hands trembled as he picked up the phone and dialed the city archives. "Archives department, this is Helen." "Helen, this is Detective Sullivan. I need you to dig up any information you can find on family dental practices operating in the city between 1945 and 1955. Specifically, I'm looking for practices that might have had a young boy connected to them. Son of the dentist, maybe?" "That's oddly specific. Any particular reason?" Marcus stared at the photograph, at the boy's perfect smile and the numbered teeth. "I'm hunting a ghost." 2 hours later, Helen called back. "Detective? I found something. Cromwell Family Dental, operated by Dr. Benjamin Cromwell from 1947 to 1953. Practice was shut down after after an incident." "What kind of incident?" "Dr. Cromwell and his wife were found dead in their home. Murder-suicide, according to the police report. But here's the thing, they had an 8-year-old son, Timothy. He was found 3 days later in the basement of the dental office, alive but traumatized." Marcus's pulse quickened. What happened to the boy? Shuffled through the foster system. No relatives would take him after. "Detective, are you sitting down? Just tell me." "The police report says the boy was found in the basement surrounded by jars. Mason jars filled with human teeth. Hundreds of them. The report suggests Dr. Cromwell had been collecting teeth from his patients for years, possibly without their knowledge. When his wife found out and threatened to expose him, he killed her and then himself." Marcus felt the room spin. "And the boy?" "Timothy Cromwell. Last known address was Riverside Foster Home, but that was 60 years ago." "Detective, there's something else. The police report mentions that when they found the boy, he was trying to arrange the teeth into patterns. Making families, they called it. Trying to reunite the teeth with photographs of the patients they'd been taken from." The line went quiet except for the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. "Detective? You still there?" "Helen, I need everything you can find on Timothy Cromwell. Every record, every document. And I need it now." As Marcus waited for the files, he studied the crime scene photos again with new eyes. The victims weren't random, they were carefully selected. Each one possessed specific teeth that Timothy needed to complete his grotesque family portrait. But which family? His original family, lost to him 60 years ago? Or was he creating something new, something even more twisted? Marcus's computer chimed. Helen had sent over a digital file containing Timothy Cromwell's foster care records. As he scrolled through the documents, a pattern emerged that made his skin crawl. Age 9. Timothy caught removing teeth from deceased pets, claiming he wanted to fix their smiles. Age 12. Found with a collection of extracted teeth hidden in his bedroom. Origin unknown. Age 15. Accused of assault after attempting to forcibly examine another boy's teeth. Charges dropped due to lack of evidence. Age 18. Aged out of the system. Last known address, 1247 Elm Street, apartment 3B. Marcus grabbed his coat and gun. Elm Street was only 15 minutes away. The apartment building was a decaying monument to urban neglect. Broken windows stared down at Marcus like empty eye sockets as he climbed the rusted fire escape to the 3rd floor. Apartment 3B's door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the evening breeze. Marcus drew his weapon and pushed the door open with his foot. The smell hit him first, a mixture of formaldehyde, decay, and something sickeningly sweet. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, the true horror of Timothy Cromwell's world revealed itself. The walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, ranging from vintage family portraits to recent snapshots. But each photo had been carefully modified, the subject's mouths cut out and replaced with actual human teeth, meticulously glued into place to create grotesque, permanent smiles. In the center of the room sat an old dentist chair, its leather cracked and stained dark brown. Beside it, a vintage dental drill hummed softly, its bit stained red. But it was the display case that made Marcus's knees buckle. Glass shelves lined the far wall, each one containing what appeared to be complete dental models. Upper and lower jaw sets mounted on medical stands. But these weren't made of plaster or resin. They were constructed entirely from human teeth, arranged to form perfect smiles that belonged to no single person. A family of smiles. Marcus counted them slowly, 2 adult sets and 1 smaller one, clearly meant to represent a child. The family Timothy had lost, recreated tooth by bloody tooth. But there was a 4th display case, empty except for a placard that read, "The detective who tried to stop me." Behind him, a floorboard creaked. "Welcome to my gallery, Detective Sullivan." Marcus spun around, weapon raised. The man standing in the doorway bore little resemblance to the cherubic boy in the photograph. Timothy Cromwell had grown into something gaunt and hollow, his face marked by years of madness. But his smile was perfect. Too perfect. Marcus realized with horror that Timothy's teeth were all different colors and sizes, clearly harvested from different victims. "You've been very helpful," Timothy continued, his voice soft and almost childlike. "Following my work so carefully. Documenting each piece of my family reunion. But you're missing something important, Detective. Put your hands where I can see them, Timothy." Timothy laughed, the sound like grinding bone. "My name isn't Timothy anymore. I gave up that name when I realized the truth. I'm the collector now." The keeper smiles. "And you, Detective Sullivan, have the most beautiful molars I've ever seen." Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger, but Timothy moved with impossible speed, lunging forward with something glinting in his hand, an old dental extraction tool. The 2 men crashed into the display cases, glass exploding around them as decades of carefully collected teeth scattered across the floor like macabre confetti. Marcus felt the extraction tool slice across his cheek as he fought to keep Timothy away from his mouth. "Don't fight it," Timothy whispered, his breath reeking of formaldehyde. "It won't hurt for long. And think of the family you'll be joining. All those beautiful smiles, together forever." Marcus managed to get his gun between them and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the apartment like thunder. Timothy's eyes went wide, more surprised than pained, as the bullet tore through his chest. He looked down at the spreading crimson stain, then back at Marcus with an expression of profound sadness. "Now who will finish the family portrait?" he whispered and collapsed among the scattered teeth. Detective Marcus Sullivan stood in the abandoned apartment 3 days later, watching as the crime scene technicians carefully catalogued and bagged each recovered tooth. The medical examiner had confirmed that the dental remains belonged to over 40 different individuals, spanning 6 decades. Some of the victims had been patients of Timothy's father. Others were more recent, people who had simply possessed the specific teeth Timothy needed to complete his obsession. The investigation would take months, possibly years, as they tried to identify and return the remains to grieving families. But one question haunted Marcus as he walked away from the building. Among all those scattered teeth, how many belonged to victims they had never found? How many families would never know what happened to their loved ones? As he reached his car, Marcus caught his reflection in the driver's side window. For just a moment he saw his own smile differently, not as something natural and human, but as a collection of individual pieces, each one unique and irreplaceable. He drove away quickly, fighting the urge to run his tongue over his teeth, checking to make sure they were all still there. Behind him, the apartment building stood silent and empty, its broken windows reflecting the dying light like a mouthful of shattered teeth. The butcher's collection was complete, but somewhere in the city's shadows, Marcus knew, another collector might already be planning their first extraction. After all, everyone has such beautiful teeth. Such perfect, individual, collectible teeth.